Okay. So we have
My,
good
my
participants.
voice is clear, actually. 1 minute. My voice is clear.
Yes, sir. I'll be doing an audio check before we start.
All right.
Yes. So participants, if you can hear myself and Professor, please raise your hands so that we know that the audio is working. Sure. Thank you, participants. You can lower your hands. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to another webinar as part of the CIC webinar series. And today with us we have Professor Thillai Rajan from IIT Madras. And he's also the co-founder of Binos. So the topic about the session today is pretty interesting. So we have about we'll be talking about startup investing post-COVID. What would the last man standing do? So as most of us are aware, this whole COVID scenario has pulled the whole system back and given a 360-degree turn. So Professor with us today will be sharing about his insights, and through his knowledge from Binos and his academic knowledge, we'll be sharing details about how the investment scenario will work post-COVID. Before we move into this session, I would like to give a small introduction about CIIC to the participants who are joining us for the first time. So CIIC is Crescent Innovation and Incubation Council. We're an incubator based out of Crescent University in Vandalur. We are funded by the Department of Science and Technology, wherein our thrust areas are life sciences and industry 4.0. Currently, we have 36 startups incubated at CIIC, and also we support student initiatives as well. So we have over 21 student startups as well with us, whom we are supporting very closely. And in terms of funding, we help startups with the government grants. At present, over 70 lakh rupees as government grants have been dispersed. And very happy to announce that during the COVID scenario, 6 of our startups have got grants through the Tamil Nadu government for their COVID supporting initiatives. And in terms of private equity and venture capital, over 39 crores has been raised through our startups through multiple rounds of funding. So moving on, my pleasure to introduce Professor Thillai Rajan. He's a professor at the Department of Management Studies at IIT Madras. He recently co-founded Vinos Venture Engine to enhance the efficiency of early stage venturing and the innovation ecosystem in India. The idea behind Vinos is to help early stage entrepreneurs identify potential investors, estimate the valuation, and perform multiple other things to understand the startup landscape. Professor Rajan has produced and edited for 10 years the annual India Venture Capital Report and Venture Capital and Private Equity Report, which serves as a major document for reference for a lot of startup entrepreneurs and investors alike. He's also been instrumental in setting up iWin Network, which is a consortium of IIT Madras, IIT Bombay, IIM Bangalore, IIM Calcutta, and IIM Kozhikode to provide research leadership, innovation, and venturing in India. Previously, he's been a Shebning Gurukul Fellow at London School of Economics, Endeavour Executive Fellow at Macquarie Graduate School of Management in Sydney, and Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellow at Harvard University. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Thillai Rajan. Over to you, sir, for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to interact and meet you once again virtually. In fact, only a few days back, I came to know that you have joined Crescent, so I think Crescent is very fortunate. Somebody who has such a inside view of what's actually happening in the Chennai and Tamil Nadu ecosystem to come and join CIC. And setting up a very professional approach in things, and I'm sure you will, under your guidance and drive, the CIC will do very well. And thanks for introducing me to the participants, and from my side, I'm going to go to all the participants. Looking at the role, I kind of get an overview, and I know that most of them are looking to be prospective entrepreneurs. And
Professor, sorry to interrupt. There seems to be an issue on the audio right now. There seems to be some blur in the audio from your side.
Okay, what should I do? So let me try to keep it a little louder.
No, sir, the voice is breaking, sir. I'm not able to hear it clearly. If you have headphones, sir, that would be possible. Would it be possible for you to try with headphones or earphones?
So actually, I don't have a headphone.
Yeah, it
Just
is fine now, sir. It is fine now. Yeah, yeah. We're back to normal.
all right.
Yes. Yes, sir. We
So
can
I
go ahead.
left saying that it is a pleasure to meet all of you. The polling results seem to indicate that many of you are going to be prospective entrepreneurs, and and you're also in some way involved in looking at developing the entrepreneurial ecosystem in your respective institutes, because some of you are faculty members as well. So let me kind of, the flow of the discussion, I will try and broadly keep it in a way that it would be kind of makes a relevance to this large group. So today, if you really look at it, entrepreneurship is something that's all pervasive in the sense that it is not only seen as just in terms of starting up, but people are saying entrepreneurship is something that, being entrepreneurial is a kind of a way of life. It's a culture, and it can be across everywhere. It can be, for example, in the courses we teach, or it could be in the subjects we learn, or in the way we do any particular assignment, and so on and so forth. So much so that at IIT Madras, we have a center called Guru Deshpande Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And so the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation does not really look at only setting up of startups, but it also looks at a variety of other things that is trying to drive an entrepreneurial culture, different levels within the institute. So given that kind of a setting today, I kind of wanted to talk to you about, essentially, ultimately, whether we entrepreneurship means that, starting up, because they form the crux of the whole thing. The nuclei is basically entrepreneurs, and how do they really kind of set up. So let me kind of structure my presentation around the topic, and then see how we can, go to the discussions as we move along. I hope my audio is holding up fine.
Yes, sir. I just checked with the participants. We've got that it's fine. The people have responded.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. In fact, in a webinar, it is very important that now, given the fact that we are not able to see each other, the technology has to work seamlessly well. Okay. So thank you, and let me go and share my screen for in a minute, and. Okay. So this is my first slide. Let me also want to talk a little bit about the topic itself, right? Because I think that needs a little bit of clarification. So when I say startup investing post-COVID, I essentially meant that the investors who are going to be investing in startups from now on, right? So what is likely what would the last man standing do? So this is this is more like a phrase, right? It doesn't really matter whether it is man or woman. What I mentioned, what I wanted to try and say here is, what would the last investor do? I mean, essentially, what would the investors do during or after COVID, right? So that's essentially going to be the subject of my talk. And, the hypothesis is that, which in a way I think is going to be a little bit true. The hypothesis is that the investors' behavior is going to fundamentally change after COVID, and we have very good reasons to be able to make that assumption. And in that assumption, what would be the investors doing post-COVID, or what kind of investors would be investing post-COVID? That is going to be the focus of this particular talk. So let me start with this small quote, which talks about how Chinese represent crisis. Right. So today, I think everybody generally goes to think this. China is responsible for this whole corona problem. But let us not get into who's actually responsible or not. But let us look at how Chinese used to write the word crisis. John F. Kennedy seemed to have once remarked that they used to represent crisis in two brushstrokes, and one standing for danger and the other standing for opportunity. And he goes on to say, in a crisis, you be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity. So I believe that entrepreneurs are inherently optimists, right? Where many others see the danger, entrepreneurs see the opportunity. So that is essentially the way in which entrepreneurs are wired, right? I mean, they are willing to look at the positive aspect of things and then see how they could really kind of address the opportunity. Okay, so let me go to this next phase. I'm going to, kind of make a small anecdotal example here, correct? I think when many of us are children, and then we used to watch a match, right? We used to watch a match, a cricket match in the TV, and we all tend to kind of, aim that, okay, Sachin Tendulkar is batting. We always have an aim that, no, someday we should be like Sachin Tendulkar, right? We should bat in the same form that he does, right? Or if whether it is Kapil Dev or any of those, we all, or it's maybe Dhoni, right? We all kind of, children kind of, aspire that they should be another Dhoni and they should be another Tendulkar. So now let us look at in the world of startups. Right? So in the world of startups, now everybody would want to kind of, have, their idol or somebody they would like to emulate. Say, for example, for many of the people who are entering college right now, they all think that I want to be like a Flipkart, and I want to be like Sachin Bansal, or I want to be like Ritesh Agarwal, right? Or, essentially people have their heroes that they would like to emulate. So if you really look at entrepreneurship, I think one of the important heroes in that entrepreneurial game has been Ambani, right? So for many people, people might not classify him as, let's say, a real entrepreneur now. He may kind of go on to qualify as a second generation entrepreneur, but nevertheless, many of the actions that he takes tend to inspire, right? So many of the entrepreneurs. For example, recently, when Jio raised close to 100,000, more than 100,000 crores from various international investors, that seems so unbelievable that somebody could raise such large amounts of money, and in a time where the economy is really, not very rosy, right? So in such a downtrend, if people are able to raise such large amounts of money, then it's really kind of inspiring. Everybody would like to, as an entrepreneur, they would like to show their mettle when the chips are down. So that means to be able to create something, to be able to do something when the chips are down gives a lot of satisfaction to any entrepreneur. So to that extent, I think this achievement by Reliance Jio in the last 2 months is phenomenal. And it's actually setting a new benchmark for so many entrepreneurs who have, some of these heroes that they would like to emulate. The second thing that I would like to highlight here is the fact that the potential that exists, the potential that investors see, right, in the down market as well. So investors are able to see, such a big opportunity that they are willing to make such a large investment in Reliance Jio. And as we all know, the announcements are coming now, but the due diligence and the homework for these investments would have started at least about 3 or 4 months ago. So that means like very much before the onset of the COVID. The fact that they are willing to follow through their commitment, right? So they could have any day withdrawn from the commitment, saying that the economy is really bad, maybe they will come back post-COVID, but they did not do so, right? They are willing to follow through their commitment and go ahead with the investment indicates the potential that the investors see in the Indian market. So this is something that all of us need to understand. As entrepreneurs, we can take comfort in the fact that investors see a lot of potential in the Indian market, and that doesn't seem to be kind of gone away in the current scenario as well. For example, a few days ago, we were trying to look at some of the deals that happen in the early stage segment. So we started looking at the number of deals that happened in February, March, April, and May. So if you really look at February and March, so that was not the time when COVID was a real scare in the Indian context. I mean, people are, things were normal, flights were going on, and everything was normal. So in February and March, the number of deals that happened in India was about 17 angel deals, 17 to 18 angel deals a month. Now, if you cut to April and May, the number of angel deals that were reported was about 30 deals in April and 30 deals in May, even slightly more than 30 in April and May, right? So what we really see is the number of angel deals that got reported doubled, right, in the COVID period. So this is a very, very strong endorsement that investors have sent in the market, saying that, there is a very, very clear potential that they are seeing, and they are not going to pull back. Serious investors who are very clear about what kind of investments they are going to make, they are not going to pull back from their investment decisions. So this is the background with which I am going to start my presentation. Okay, now this is very familiar curve. Today, if I show this curve to even maybe let's say a 10-year-old child, the child will be able to clearly understand, oh, this curve is what is called as the corona curve, right? So everywhere, this curve has become so popular. They're talking about, flattening of the curve. They're talking about exponential growth of the curve and so on. Right? So if you look at the curve, what do we see is we see a phase of gestation, and then we see a phase of exponential growth, and then we see a phase where the curve flattens out. Okay. So now for the entrepreneur, for the normal people, if you really look at this as a corona curve, obviously it is very scary, right? The way in which the corona is spreading and so on and so forth. But then, so this is a curve that an entrepreneur has been, familiar for a long, long time, right? Let's say, for example, if I go to the next slide. So we are talking about what is called as a classical S-shaped curve, right? And a classical S-shaped curve, what we have is a gestation portion, which is called as a blade portion. And then we have a period of exponential growth, or it's also called as a hockey stick growth. And between these two is the inflection point, right? What does the inflection point indicate? The inflection point indicates that not all of the startups will enter the path of hockey stick growth, right? There are many startups which do not pass the inflection point and they tend to fail. But the few startups that are able to cross over the inflection point and enter the phase of hockey stick growth experience tremendous and fast growth in a very short period of time before the growth rate tapers off and the startups become mature. So this is a traditional, whatever you may want to call it, it's called a hockey stick curve, or it's called a S-shaped curve, or some may call a variation of this as a J-shaped curve, and so on and so forth. Correct. So this is a curve that as an entrepreneur, we are always wanted to aspire for, right? Any entrepreneur will essentially aspire to achieve this kind of a growth. So seen from, let's say, the corona growth curve, this curve is not very different. So as an entrepreneur, we're always wanted to, basically track a growth path that is very similar to what a virus takes, right? So that's essentially what is it. So we are no different from the virus, but then essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to probably not leave destruction, not leave deaths in the place, but leave a lot of value in the economy. So now what is actually happening when we really look at entrepreneurship, right? So the way we are seeing is the successful entrepreneur is the one who makes the transformation from who's he to who's who. Correct. So when you start a company, when you start a small venture, so we are in a stage where people don't know the entrepreneur, right? People don't know the entrepreneur, and they kind of who's he? So that's what people are going to think, right? So at a very initial stage, which I would call as a who's he stage, how is the business funded? Right? So the business is funded by founder capital, and then you also have, let's say, incubation and small grants from, for example, Crescent, like from organizations like Crescent, which provide a lot of favorable ecosystem and various incubation small grants, and then we have some family members who is also going to support. Right? And from who's he to who's who, the journey is supported by various stakeholders in the startup ecosystem, but primarily I think investors play a very important role in the transformation of an entrepreneur from who's he to who's who. Right? Now you can come back to me and ask the question, is it necessary to always have investors? The answer is no. But then what do we see in the country today, right? What do we see in the country today, or what is the general trend is, most of the startups that have been successful, when I say successful, that have actually achieved high rates of growth and visibility in a short frame of time, have actually taken money from external investors. So that is what we are seeing today. I mean, I'm not saying that whether it is right or wrong or whether exceptions do not exist, but what we are seeing today is investors play a very important role in this transformation from who's he to who's you. Right? So the first set of external investors would be the angel investors. So many of you know who are angel investors. Angel investors are those who have been successful entrepreneurs themselves, and later on they turn into investors because they want to give back something to the entrepreneurial community. Because being entrepreneur themselves, they understand the challenges, they understand the difficulties, and they want to, they turn investors to give back something to the entrepreneurial community. So most of the time what happens, the first round of external capital comes from angel investors. So that's the first, what is called as a baby step. As the startup goes out and start looking at external capital, the first baby step happens to be angel investors. And then subsequently, there can be multiple rounds of funding. So these funds, there can be in many stages and many rounds. So we can broadly put them together as venture funds, right? So this can be seed stage funding, this can be venture funding, this can be growth funding, this can be late stage funding. So there are multiple rounds of funding that happens, and all of them together can be called as venture funding. Right. And then finally, when you say that you have arrived, so when do we really say that somebody has arrived is when they are able to successfully make a public offering, or when they are able to successfully sell their enterprise, right? Either a mergers and acquisition. So going forward, so I talked about investors, right? I talked about investors. So that means what? When I say investors, so that means the journey from who's he to who's who essentially needs a lot of liquidity, right? The company needs capital to make the journey. So now let us look at different sources of capital that are available for startups. Right? So we have broadly 4 different types of categories. So I am really, talking about early stage startups because that is what we're really concerned in, right? So if you really look at it, the mortality rates are very, very high at the early stage of a startup. Once the startups are able to get the first round of funding, then the success ratio, it just kind of multiplies manyfold. Right? So let us kind of look at analyzing the need for liquidity for early stage startups, and that can broadly come from 4 different sources. So one is we have angel investors. Okay? So I just briefly mentioned about angel investors. So there are different categories of angel investors, though we kind of broadly group them together. We have occasional investors, we have regular investors, we have business angels, we have financial angels, and so on and so forth. There are different categories. The main feature of angel investors is the speed, right? The quickly make a decision. So when I say speed, that doesn't mean that they take decision in a second, right? They probably might take decisions very faster, but then what happens is, it still takes time to go through the paperwork and for the money to come into the company, correct? So you should really kind of budget for about 3 to 4 months for the investment to come into angel investors. The second major difference for angel investors is value addition. So that means not only they give money, they want to significantly help the entrepreneur. So that means they want to get their hands dirty, right? They want to actually come and to visit your startup. They want to see how you can help. That's a kind of value addition that angel investors want to make. That's a big characteristic of angel investors. So then you have seed funds. So seed funds, they're looking at a specific sectors and stage, right? Like for example, most of the time seed funds say, our focus area is this particular stage, this particular domain, and we make investments up to $250,000 or up to about a crore and so on. So they have very, very clear definition in terms of what kind of ventures that they're looking at. Vis-a-vis angel investors, no, they are investing their personal capital, so they don't really have a very clear definition on what they will invest. I mean, they may have their preference, but it is not clearly stated. So then we also have another category of seed funds is in terms of quantum and value addition. They invest certain amounts of capital that is much higher than angel investors. If you're looking at angel investors investing about from 20 lakhs to a crore, seed funds can invest up to about 2 crores, 1.5 to 2 crores is the kind of range that they may normally invest. And then they also look at value addition. Like the angel investors, the seed funds also want to play a very active role in terms of managing the startup. So then, one of the important traits that we would like to see is, they have something called as the all for some. So most of the seed funds, what they'll do is they actually look at a lot of opportunities, right? They look at a lot of opportunities before they decide which ones they will like to invest. But once they decide to make an investment, they will try and invest significant amounts. They'll try and invest significant amounts. So that I would call as an all for some approach. So that means they invest in some startups, they invest in some companies, but they will invest significant amounts in these companies. Then we have government agencies. So government agencies, again, there are several different government arms which provide support. They have well-defined areas for support, government agencies. The only problem, right? The only problem is, I'm not saying the only problem. There are several problems. So one of the important problems with government agencies, it takes a long time, right? You never know. You apply, but you never know when it is going to be processed and when you are going to get something from that. And secondly, they also do not do much value addition, right? They may probably provide capital, but they may not be able to help the startup in any other form, right? They may not be a mentor. They cannot open doors. They cannot really look at help in recruitment, or they cannot give help in terms of strategy. So there's a big difference in terms of investment from government agencies. And sometimes what happens is the government agencies looks at supporting as many startups as possible, right? So it's like, mother. What does a mother do? So mother would ensure that none of the children go starving. So whatever little food is there, then the mother would tend to distribute among all the children that are, that is there in the household. So that is called as a sum for all approach. And this is what the government agencies tend to do, right? If they have about, let's say, 10 crore allocated for investing in startups, so what they may do is, they may invest maybe 10 lakh, right? They may invest 10 lakh in 100 startups. So that will be an approach. But whereas, what would a seed fund do is a seed fund might invest 1 crore in 10 startups. So they are very selective, but when they make investment, they make a large quantum of investment. But government agencies, they are not so selective. They give very limited support to a large number of people. And then finally, most of the government agencies would require the founders to invest, right? They require the founders to invest, before they can start getting some form of assistance from government agencies. And finally, we have debt. Debt is a major problem, right, for early stage startups, because you have to pay interest, and interest means there is a cash outflow. When cash inflows are very minimal for the startup, how do you really take care of the cash outflows? And many times you're not able to get debt because there is a lack of collateral. Many of the new age startups, they don't really have tangible assets. They are looking at more intangible assets. So there is a lack of collateral. And the banks, most of whom banks which actually provide debt funding, they are not in a position to appraise the risk that is there in startup, in the sense that they don't really understand. They don't understand how a startup functions, and therefore that's one of the major limitations for debt. So now if you really look at these four sources, right? These four sources, out of four, because there is going to be a downtrend in three of the sources, like for example, seed funds, government agencies, and debt. The outlook is not very, very bright, right? Why? For example, The seed funds, you see many of the limited partners can withdraw their commitments. They might have earlier said they will invest, but now they may withdraw their commitments. They are also not sure about the demand for the product or service, right? So therefore, they are unsure which venture they should have to invest, right? And they also find the growth prospects are fairly muted. Earlier, if the Indian economy was, the GDP was growing at 6%, 7%, then the venture would have grown at a certain rate. But now, if people are expecting the Indian economy to be in a recession, then what is likely to happen? The growth prospect of the venture should be even more lesser. So therefore, the growth prospects are muted, and therefore the seed funds are going to find it very difficult to make investments. Government agencies. Now, obviously, like you all know, in a government funding, whoever cries the loudest, government is forced to provide assistance to them, right? And then that's invaluably that is what is actually happening, right? So if you really look at government agencies in the context of a COVID, we all see that there are so many demands for capital. Like for example, Tamil Nadu government is asking for capital. Every other state is asking for capital. There are other natural disasters that is happening like cyclones and all that. So government, there is. On the other hand, we are saying revenues. Revenues have considerably shrunk because of this GST, and tax revenues have drastically reduced. So therefore, the government support is going to be restricted to those essential areas during this period. So that means, government might tend to slash the budget for those that are essential. For example, just look at it, right? Many of the government, governments in India today, they have kind of froze the DA component, right? They have froze the DA component. So means what actually? So that means, they are not willing to kind of provide support even for some of the important or what is considered to be things like salary expenses and all that. So given that kind of a context, government support for startups, I believe, is going to be extremely limited, right? Because it is not seen as a major priority sector, at least in terms of capital allocation for the government. So now, how do I say so? Because I'm saying so because now I also happen to analyze our finance minister's address and statements when they announced the stimulus program. Right? When Nirmala Sitharaman was making the announcement for the stimulus program, that is 20 lakh crores in 2020, not even once did the word startup got mentioned in the whole speech that continued for 5 days. So that is probably a hint, correct? To see that, okay, startups may not be the priority sector right now for the government. So therefore, the support from the government agencies is again, they're not going to be very bright. And then, if you look at debt, there is, NPA problems, and the NPA problems could get, even more enhanced post-COVID. So the banks are going to be extremely careful in terms of, see, on the one hand, the government say that there is going to be a lot of loans that are available, but then on the ground situation is that banks are reluctant. So most of the banks are reluctant to be able to provide debt. So the short-term demand still, until short-term demand unclear for many of the goods and services. So the banks are not very sure. So among these 4 different sources, I would think the angel investors is the only source that doesn't see so much of, uncertainty, right? I find angel investors are going to shrink the lowest among the different categories. It seems to be the most promising and most viable in the current in the current situation. Right? Okay, this is a small statistic. I kind of wanted to leave it with you just in case you are curious about the gender between promoters and investors. Among the investors, you find only about less than 5% of the investors are women, and 87% are men. So now if I go back and look at the topic, why did I choose what did the last man standing do? It's simply because majority of the investors in the Indian startups have been women. So that's basically more like a trivia that I wanted to leave it to you with. So when we look at angel investors, we have to understand the nature of the angel investors. So remember, when we go and talk to an investor, it is we have to understand about the investor, right? We need not expect the investor should understand the entrepreneur. It's not always both ways, right? As an entrepreneur, we have to ensure that we are able to meet the expectations and demands of the investors, because we are seeking capital, right? So this is a small cartoon. I just thought I will insert here as to more to kind of lighten up the mood that we have in this webinar. But now let me go forward. So if you look at angel investors can be classified into 4 different categories. You have the regular investors, and then we have the occasional investors, then we have the business angels and financial angels. Regular investors are those who are likely to make regular investments in these startups. Like for example, most of them have a pattern of investing about in 3 or 4 startups every year minimum, right? Those are all regular investors. And then we have what is called as the occasional investors. Maybe they will make 1 or 2 investments in a year. They may not be very regular. So those are what we call as occasional investors. So then we have business angels. Just give me a minute. Let me take a sip of water. So I trust the audio is holding good, isn't it?
Yes, sir, it's perfect.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So we have business angels. Business angels are those who essentially have entrepreneurial experience. They are entrepreneurs. They are successful entrepreneurs. Now they want to come back and invest. And then you have financial angels. Financial angels need not be successful entrepreneurs. They may be successful in any other. For example, they are all rich individuals. For example, you have doctors. You have you have celebrities, you have sports persons, you have lawyers. So these are all people who are rich, who are wealthy, and they also want to make investments in startups because they think that investing in startups is very fashionable. And to be called an angel investor, I was speaking to some angel investor. Then I was checking with him, right? Why do there's a strong interest among angel investors? So then I said, today when you call yourself an angel investor, you find it's a very sexy term to use. So therefore, people want to be known as an angel investor, right? So they have a very different motivation to invest in startups, but then primarily they look at getting returns, right? Most of the financial angels, they need to make good returns, and they think that angel investment is an opportunity for them to get good returns. So out of these 4 categories, I think the occasional investors are going to be the ones who is likely to continue to making an investment. See, for example, if you look at regular investors, they already have substantial investments made, and now they will be concerned about the health and willingness of the investments. So I think Aragammal has raised a hand. I don't know whether it is for a question. But what I thought I will do is I will quickly finish my presentation before we can take the questions all at one go, if that is okay. So that will ensure that maybe we are able to kind of quickly move through the presentation. So most of the regular investors will be more concerned about monitoring their existing portfolio rather than making new investments. So that segment is going to go a little low. Then we have occasional investors. Occasional investors are those who see an opportunity and then they make an investment. They may not be regular investors, but they invest on and off, right? Whenever they think there's an opportunity, they are going to make an investment. And then you have business angels, and then you have financial angels. Business angels are likely to continue to make investments because they know this phase is going to be this phase is not going to be permanent, and therefore they're continuing to make investments. Financial angels, they likely to shrink the entire investment because now most of the financial angels, like we see, the business environment is down. Many people might not actually, they might have lost their jobs, or there are a lot of uncertainty in the corporate scenario, and therefore many of the financial angels they may stick to safe investment opportunities in the current context. So now let us look at the angel investors landscape in India, right? If you look at the angel investors landscape in India, so if you see different circles, here, the circles are of different sizes, right? So the size indicates the number of angel investors, right? So if you really look at among the total angel investors, we have 1,029 of them who have made only one investment, right? So, and then there are 419 who have made only 2 investments. So that means these are essentially what we call as occasional investors, right? So they are not going to invest. They make very few investments. They make once in a while. They are very infrequent investors. So if you look at the Indian landscape, a majority of them are what we call as occasional investors, right? So now what did we see in the previous slide? In the previous slide, I was mentioning that the occasional investors, we believe, will continue to invest in startups. So that means we are looking at a landscape where we have majority of the investors who will continue to make investments. So it's a small number of regular investors who will likely to kind of pull back their investment programs. And that's few and far. That's few and far in between, right? We don't have many investors making very regular investments. So next we go to the age of startups at the time of investment. So again, if you look at it, here again, circles of different sizes. The size indicates the number of startups and the age at which they have been funded. Right? For example, 464 startups have been funded within a year of they being founded. Right? And 514 startups have been funded within 2 years after within 2 years after they have been founded. So what you find is a majority of the startups are getting funding or getting angel funding within the first 2 years after they have been founded. That's important for us to understand, right? If you cross this phase, if you fail to raise investment within the first 2 years, then subsequently the chances of getting fundraising becomes lower because either the startups are not able to sustain, or they don't need angel investments because they have grown to an extent where they can sustain on their own. Or it is also possible that the angel investors do not consider startups beyond 2 or 3 years simply because they feel that if a startup has not been able to raise capital in the first 2 years, then there is something wrong with them. So maybe they don't consider these startups as viable. So we don't have multiple reasons. So now let's look at the age of promoters at the time of investment, right? So the age of promoters at the time of investment is 33.25 years. So that's a normal time at which they're able to raise investment. But if you look at the age of the investors, right? The age of the investors is 43. So that means there is a clear 10-year difference, right? There's a clear 10-year difference between the average age of entrepreneurs and the average age of investors. So that's a very interesting point that we should all note. So that means the investors have a chronological age that is higher than that of the entrepreneur. So an entrepreneur, you need to be able to think what would an investor think, because he is 10 years older, right? An investor is 10 years older, and therefore he is likely to have more experience as compared to that of the entrepreneur. So therefore an entrepreneur should be mentally prepared to be able to position his startup to a person who has a lot more experience. Let's also look at the startup investor proximity. If you look at the distance between the investor domicile and the city in which the startup is based, you find that 35% of all the investment happen in the same city where the investor is also located. So that means the investor invests 35% of the time in the same city that he is also domiciled at. So this actually is very important, right? Because when you go and look at investments, the first thing that you should try and reach out is look for investors in your own city, right? Because that basically people are more comfortable in investing in startups in their own city because they don't have to travel to monitor. Now they may probably have overlapping areas of interest. They may have common friends, and all of them makes it very easy for the investors to track the investments. So what is the new normal? So this I thought we will talk about it. So there is going to be uncertainty in product markets as well as capital markets. See, at always, really looking at an early stage venture, there is always going to be uncertainty in product markets as well as capital markets. It's just that the uncertainty has increased many-fold because of COVID. Right? So earlier, people knew whether this is how there is going to be consumer behavior and so on and so forth. Right? This is how people are willing to spend. But today, there is so much uncertainty. We don't even know when, whether people will be willing to spend or not. Right? There is product markets and capital markets. There is so much uncertainty. Because of this uncertainty, discretionary spending will reduce significantly. People are not willing to going to splurge in holidays. They're not willing to spend in maybe gadgets. They're not willing to spend in high-end clothing. So the discretionary expense that that people used to see earlier will reduce significantly. The mortality rates will increase. Right? When I say mortality rates, I'm saying mortality rates not of people but of startups. The failure rates of startups is going to increase simply because getting capital, might be very difficult, and it also take a longer duration to raise capital. For example, earlier, if one was able to raise capital in 3 months, in the new normal, it may take 4 months, it may take 5 months, it may take 6 months, right? So there is a longer investment horizon that is, and that will be seen. So therefore, what would the entrepreneurs look at is most of the entrepreneurs might look at bootstrapping. That is to grow their venture purely by internally generated capital or through many other innovative forms. For example, by pre-selling their products and services or by looking at partnerships and so on. So the bootstrapping and some such strategies will become very important. And then there'll be focus on costs, right? There'll be significant focus on costs. People will be merciless in terms of cutting costs and ensuring that they are able to increase the length of the runway. To see, it is very important, right? Many of you might have, had this share by Jack Ma, right, who founded this Alibaba. So he simply said that, now, if you are able to survive, right, the question is not about making profits and all that, right? The question is about survival in this COVID phase. If you are able to survive, then you already made a profit, right? So the question is, are we able to survive? And one of the important elements for survival is how long will your funding last, right? How long will your runway be available? So that means that can happen only if you focus on cost, because there is very, very limited scope for increasing the price and therefore increasing the revenues. The one thing that management can play around with in terms of cost. And we'll also see some new sunrise sectors, like for example, there is healthcare, there is work from home solutions, there is personal transport, material science, and so on. So for each and every sector that has lost out, for example, travel, for example, there is hospitality, there is or entertainment. So there are many sectors that have lost out in this COVID regime, but for each and every sector that have lost out, new sector has emerged, right? So today, as you all know, we are supposed to be one of the largest manufacturers of personal protective equipment in the whole world. Remember, this industry did not exist 2 months ago. So similarly, we are one of the largest producer of masks in the whole world. So this industry did not exist, right? So several such, sectors, several such industries can kind of quickly, come. And as entrepreneurs, we need to be able to quickly leverage these new opportunities and benefit from it. Okay, so this brings to the end of my presentation, and maybe we could throw it open for questions. So what I will do now is I will stop the share and return to the regular mode, and then we can take a few questions.
Sure, sir. I'll read the questions from the Q&A section.
Wonderful. Okay.
Q&A sections are at the bottom. Sir, there's a mix of generic question as well as question based on investment. So can we stick alone to investment-based questions? Would that be okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Sir, so the first question to start with, how to find the right investor for a startup, especially when you're not an incubator anywhere?
So how to find the right investor? So that's a very good question. And So in fact, that is going to be a little bit of a challenge here. The reason is, if you look at angel investor, there is very little information that is available about the angel investor outside. Right? See, for example, if you go to a bank and then says, I want to apply for a financial assistance, banks gives you detail, right? Banks tells you what kind of investments they make, what is the qualifying criteria and all of those things. Or if you use any venture fund or a seed fund, they are able to clearly articulate on what is their what are they looking for when they want to make an investment. But an angel investor doesn't have any of this, so therefore it becomes very difficult. So we will have to start making inference based on their past investments. So that will give an idea in terms of what is the kind of expectations that they have, or what kind of companies they invest. So now getting that information is not so easy, right? Getting that information not so easy because this is not publicly available. So that is the first challenge. Second challenge is, for how many investors will you search for this information? So today in India, if you're looking at, there are 5,000 angel investors who are reasonably active, who make investments. For how many of them will you search about their investment preferences? That is going to be extremely difficult, right? To be able to manually search for such large number of investors. So therefore, you will have to rely on a particular tool. So in fact, this is a major problem that we realized, right? So when entrepreneurs are not in a position to find out who is the best investor, what they do is they pray, right? They pray that, okay, let me kind of send out an email and expect that there will be some interest among the investors. So this is called the spray and pray approach, right? I have this list of, I have the email of this 100 investors. Let me send out this email to all these 100 investors, and then let me see if any of them are going to show interest. So that is not a very scientific and systematic way of approaching this in this activity at all. So we said that can we do it something which will help to improve the efficiency of the fundraising process at Winos. And what we therefore did was we developed a technology platform where the entrepreneurs are able to identify who are the most appropriate investors, who would be the most suitable investors for their particular venture. So we made the task very, very simple for the entrepreneurs by being able to recommend investors quickly. So what I'm going to do is in the chat box, let me type the website of our startup, and I would like to invite others to maybe take a look at it and then check how whether they are finding the investors that they want. So we can go to the next question actually.
Yes, sir. So the next is, pertaining to the graph which you had shown. So it says, whether the inflection point is a turning point or is just, a point of increase.
So there are two types. One is basically the linear growth, right? So there is a linear growth. Not all of the startups actually have an inflection point. So it's a very good question. So there is a linear growth. So the linear growth is a characteristic of a mature company. Right? So if you really look at it, one of the main features that distinguishes a startup from, let's say, an SME or from a large company is the high growth rate in a very short period of time. That's the main characteristic. Because if we don't see that phase of high growth, then it becomes more like an SME, right? It will not be in a position to meet the return expectations of an equity investor. It will be definitely willing to meet the return expectations of a debt investor, but an equity investor, it will not be able to meet. So the question is, it's not necessary for all companies to actually have an inflection point, but to qualify for a tag of a startup, it's expected that you have an inflection point, because that's what you will actually experience the exponential growth. Not having an inflection point is not a bad thing at all when there are several businesses which have a very, very steady growth. But it's just that it may be very difficult to meet the return expectations of an external investor by a very steady growth kind of a business scenario.
So the next one is, can you name a few occasional investors?
So that is, often I'm finding it very difficult, because ultimately we are so involved in, developing the technology platform offhand, I'm not able to. I mean, there are so many names that I would have remembered by seeing the platform, but offhand I'm unable to. But just to say that, let's say we are in our database of close to 2,200, about 1,015 are occasional, or 1,015 or close to 1,500 occasional investors, right? So a very, very large number, a large subset of investors are what we call as occasional investors.
Okay. So the next one is on approaching the investors. So what would be the right way to approach an angel investor? No, is it just the presentation would do, or do we need any other additional ammunition to go to an angel investor?
Okay, so this is a good question, and in fact, at a different location, I have also kind of listed out what would be the best way to get investment, right? So the best way to get an investment is by telling them that you don't need their capital, right? In fact, when you go to when you go to a person and then say, can you invest, the person becomes, really suspicious and scary, because particularly if you don't know them, right? So I would kind of, informally, jokingly suggest that you tell somebody that you don't need the money, then they will be more willing to invest, right? So that means you find an investor who actually makes investments, but then the best way to approach is to meet them and then tell them that, oh, this is an interesting venture that you have started and you would like to get their inputs, right? You would like to get their inputs in terms of what they think about the potential of this business.
Okay.
So you essentially develop some kind of a rapport, develop some kind of a contact, and then maybe after about 2 or 3 months or after a couple of meetings, please gently approach the investment possibility. So that will work out, a lot better rather than straight away sending a presentation, straight away sending a requirement, investment prospectus. Ask for their inputs before you ask for the money.
Okay, so the next one is, according to you, what will be the flourishing and in-demand sectors for startups in the upcoming years post the lockdown and the corona? Like you mentioned a few sunrise sectors. Are there anything specific to the science or the research field where there will be a lot of scope to start a business?
I missed the second part of the question, Akshay. Could you come again?
Yes, sir. So the flourishing and in-demand sectors in the science space, which is research and research-related domains in science.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
What will be the in-demand and flourishing sectors post-corona?
Now, see, for example, the same sectors, there is a lot of innovation, and when you talk about innovation, there is science and technology behind it. See, for example, each of the sectors that I have mentioned, for example, healthcare. So healthcare obviously is predominantly driven by science. Let's say even a simple things like trying to manufacture more effective sanitizer, right? So there is be a lot of science behind it, right? A sanitizer that is maybe has better efficiency, lasts longer, or maybe easy to manufacture. There are several characteristics, and these cannot be done without science. So science is always there. Second, for example, let's say work from home solutions. So people are invariably predicting that the current trend of working from home is more likely to continue. It may not quickly taper off. So therefore, when you work from home solution, this will again be technology driven, right? How do you ensure that we are able to use, let's say, 5G technologies? When you have 5G technologies, how can we really develop work from home solutions to take leverage the 5G technologies? Things like that. Similarly, when we really look at personal transport, right? So today, I think one of the biggest thing that I think will open up is many people will find public transport riskier, and many people will also find, depending on public transport, there's a lot of uncertainty. So therefore, the private transport will boom. So when the private transport booms, invariably again, with the focus on environment and all that, people might actually focus on electric vehicles. So again, there is a significant amount of inputs from engineering, science, and technology that will be involved here. So it's a very good question. So most of these sunrise sectors will be driven by science and technology, right? It's not something that's purely e-commerce led businesses. That's not purely business innovation or process innovation, but it's going to be a lot of science and technology that's behind these new business.
Okay, sir. The next one is a very typical, startup question. So the participant asked, how do I broadcast my startup concept to angel investors? Are there any forums where I can meet a lot of investors, interact with them, or get feedback?
There are plenty of forums. I think, for example, there is TAI Chennai. Then there are several angel forums. See, what really happens is, in my view, much of the decision happens during a one-on-one meeting. There are several pitches that happen where there are a group of investors and then you go ahead and pitch. For example, many of the entrepreneurs might be familiar with what is called as the Shark Tank, kind of a. So we all know how true the Shark Tank is, right? I mean, it's all made for the reality TV, but it actually may not, happen in that fashion. So my recommendation is not to really look for a single forum where you can meet multiple investors. But if you really need to be successful, it has to be done one-on-one outside of any of these melas. So that's what I would like to call them. Many of the pitch fests are essentially what I would call as melas. They have a large number of people presenting business plans. Hundreds of people send the entry for the business plan, so that get shortlisted. And then maybe about 25 to 25 business plan get presented. And then finally about 2 or 3 get. So just look at the probability, right? The probability of getting funding in all these pitch fests, it's probably, 2%, right? So when somebody is going to all these pitch fests, the more the chances that you are not part of the 2%, because the remaining 98% don't get any investment. So the best and the most productive way is to carefully headhunt who is going to be the investor, and then very, very diligently follow up with the investor, and then see if you could kind of have a one-on-one meeting with them. That will give a lot more productive, dividends, rather than attending and participating in all this pitch fests. Obviously, the pitch fests are good maybe to know the names of different investors, but from an investor perspective or from an entrepreneur perspective, it may not be very productive. But for an investor perspective, it is very productive, because in one place they're able to see about 200 entrepreneurs, right? And it's very good. It saves a lot of time for them. But for an entrepreneur perspective, it may not be so productive.
Okay, so the next question is particular to 2 sectors, which is agri and aqua, which is water conservation or water solutions related startup. So
Okay.
since considering, it's a pretty long question actually. So considering that lot of investors are into sustainable growth and environment, and this is all, both these startups are directly related to food security. Where do you think it is heading post COVID, based on the logistical issues and challenges, agri and aqua?
So I don't really have any familiarity with these 2 sectors, unfortunately, except that I want to give a very general observation. The general observation is, in these kinds of sectors, the growth is more likely to be linear or slightly, maybe exponential. The inflection point that we would normally tend to expect that we see in a technology is unlikely to be witnessed in agri and food tech. So therefore, the kind of investors that one will have to look at will also have to be very different. So traditionally, the angel investors are those who are looking for this inflection kind of growth, inflection in growth or inflection in valuation or whatever it may be. But these 2 sectors, given the fact that that is unlikely to happen, one would have to choose an investor who has very strong familiarity with these 2 sectors, because when they get in familiarity, then they will understand the challenges and they'll be able to empathize with the entrepreneur a lot more, right? So that is number 1. No point having a standard angel style investor in these 2 sectors, because they may find it they may not be so patient. The second is Now we also have to target specific funds. For example, if you look at food processing, Ministry of Food Processing has specific schemes in which they can invest in startups. So those kinds of domain-based opportunities are one that will be more productive rather than. In terms of how the industry is going to shape up, I am actually completely clueless in terms of how the industry will be. But I believe that for a large country like India, innovations possibilities are there across the spectrum. It need not be only in IT, it need not be only in e-commerce, it need not be only in health tech. So it can be in each and every sector. So it depends on how much they are able to address the requirements in that particular sector.
Sir, and last two questions. So finally, what are the three most important things or criteria or priority which an investor would look at when judging a startup?
So the judging a startup, I think primarily if you look at angel investor as a criterion, right? See, ultimately angel investors are banking their investment on the entrepreneur, right? So one is they look at how comfortable they are with the idea, right? They should be in a position to understand the idea, right? If they are able to understand the idea, then they become more comfortable, right? That is one. Second is they want to see how much trustworthy the entrepreneur is. See, ultimately, trust plays a very, very important role. See, we don't have a track record. There is always a lot of uncertainty. Somehow the investor feels that the entrepreneur is not going to play dirty. The entrepreneur is going to have the best interest of the investors in mind in when running the startup. Then it gives them a lot of comfort, right? And three, the entrepreneurs are going to look at ultimately is the entrepreneur looking at giving some kind of a return for us, right? It should not be taken as an investment that is purely as a grant, right? Is the entrepreneur sensitive to the fact that they should give some return to it may happen or it may not happen for a variety of reasons, but then uh, the intent should be there, right? The intent of the entrepreneur to provide an exit and a return to the investor, that should be there. So to summarize, I would kind of look at it three broad parameters. There are of course several other criteria. For example, people will look at how different is the business, what is the growth potential, and all of this. But before you even reach there, I think these three will be very important. One is the familiarity. The second is the trustworthiness. And third is the intent from the entrepreneur to be able to give some kind of return.
Sir, I think that's about the question, sir. Sir, and on general requests, so few participants told about some collateral where they can read more about this. So, is the VCP report available online from where they can download or something like that? Would an e-copy be available somewhere?
So what we have done is in our website, YNOS website. So we have what is called as a thought leadership section, right? And then we also have our media publications that we have made. For example, there are several open opinion pieces that has appeared in the paper, and then these talk about in a very easy to read fashion about some of what I talked about. And it will also address many of the questions that entrepreneurs have in mind, students and other participants who attended this. So it's all available in one place, so they could go ahead and look at it. The venture capital reports also are available for them to download and then take a look at it. Yes, they are available in the platform.
Okay, sir. I think that's about the question, sir.
So before you summarize, maybe I can do a quick summary.
Yes, sir. I was about to tell that, please.
Okay. So let me share the screen again. So we started off with the question. What would the last man standing do? But at the end of this talk, I would like you to leave you with the question: what should the startup founder do? Right? See, for example, we have understood what will be the investment preferences of an angel investor. We have understood what are the kind of constraints that the investors would have. So therefore, it is imperative for us as founders to be able to modify our strategies, right? We should modify our strategies. We should understand, we should be sensitive to the changed environment. And that is what is going to be more successful in getting investment. If the investors had behaved in a such a fashion before COVID, it is very unlikely that they will behave in the same fashion even post COVID, right? So they are going to be a big difference. So as startup founders, as somebody who's interested in entrepreneurship, we should be able to understand the change that has actually happened and then appropriately change our strategies. So that would be my summary for this webinar. So over to you, Akshay.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. As usual, it was a very wonderful session and extremely informative one. The numbers speak for the ecosystem. So I would encourage participants to have a look at Vinau's website. Professor has shared the link on chat. I'll again just post it back for the benefit of the participants. You will get all sort of information about investments and investment related activities. So again, sir, it's my pleasure to have had you today, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of Crescent Innovation and Incubation Council for this wonderful session. And we received a very positive feedback from the participants also on the chat window. So again, sir, thank you so much for sparing time of your schedule and being with us today.
Thank you so much, Akshay. I would like to thank you specifically for emceeing the webinar in such a nice fashion. And I have, this is one of the best webinars in terms of coordination and the way it has been facilitated. So thank you so much for being part of this webinar throughout and also taking the time out and providing all the support for us and to my team and doing this in such a smooth fashion. And to all the participants, I'd like to give a big thanks for taking the time out in your busy schedule. And I'd be delighted to stay connected with you through LinkedIn. And I will also share you my email at IIT Madras. So please feel free and do drop a note and then we can stay connected in LinkedIn. Thank you so much. And I just type my email ID here. And LinkedIn, you could just search my name and then you can just, if you can send a note, I'd kind of gladly, accept and then be connected with you. So thank you so much. And I wish you all a very nice evening.
Thank you so much. Always a great session. So participants, if you have any requirements or requests to reach out to any of our speakers, you can reach out to the CISC office and we'll be extremely happy to connect you and help you out. So with this, we'll like to call it a day and end the webinar. Thank you so much, participants. Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you so much, Shruti, for helping us organize session. Thank you. I'll end the webinar for everybody. Participants, I'll end the webinar for you now. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.